Hey everyone, and welcome to Risky Business. My name's Patrick Gray. This week's edition of Risky Business is brought to you by Thinkst Canary, which makes the canary honeypots that you can plug into your network. They also operate the canarytokens.org service. They're a great company, well loved in the cybersecurity discipline. And Thinkst's Marco Slaviero will be along in this week's sponsor interview to talk about a blog post he wrote, which is about unfashionable choices in security engineering. In other words, they talk about why they use one VM per customer when operating a cloud service instead of building some sort of infinitely scalable web application that's always going to have a bug in it, which will let one customer own all of the other customers. That's actually a really fun chat, and it's coming up after the news. I will say, though, that we won't be running that sponsor interview in the YouTube video because of a technical fault. We only have audio on that one. So if you're watching the video, hi. Unfortunately, we will not be able to show that to you. But that's a reminder too to people who are listening to the show that we are now publishing the weekly show to YouTube every week. And so far it's going pretty good. But we are going to get into the week's news now with Adam Boileau. And not surprisingly, mate, we're going to start off with more sort of Cloudstrike related, cleanup stories. And it looks like we've got the first investor lawsuit here. It's probably going to turn into a class action. It's being kicked off by some sort of pension fund in the United States. Cybersecurity Dive has a write-up on that. And we're also seeing a bunch of to and fro between lawyers for Delta Airlines, which of course claims to have lost around $500 million, through this whole event. So an argy-bargy between their lawyers and lawyers representing Crowdstrike and Microsoft.
Yeah, it was a mess for a lot of people, and it's not surprising, especially given the American, how the American system works, that we would see, this going off into the courts. And we've seen both Microsoft and Crowdstrike kind of hit back at Delta. And Microsoft, for example, said that some of the systems that caused Delta to be down for so long, like their crew management systems or whatever else, weren't even running on Microsoft platforms. So but, overall, given I guess we're going to see whether the license, the click-through licenses for Crowdstrike would kind of limit their liability to, I think the total cost of their service. So at worst, millions. We're going to see how that turns out.
This is for the courts to work out, yes. Right? So I'm not sure about the pointy clicky through license versus the contracts that Crowdstrike might enter into with their customers. We're not lawyers. We don't really know. But what we can say is that we have some leaked correspondence from Crowdstrike's lawyers responding to Delta's lawyers. And it is, it's a little bit sassy, right? Because they're saying, well, we offered to help you get back up and running. We never heard back from you. You just ignored us, which I don't know. I mean, I bet they had a bit going on at the moment, at that moment. So I'm not sure that they could have been expected to respond. But I think the interesting part there, is that they do make the point. Well, why was it that your competitors who are our customers were able to get back up and running and you weren't? And as much as I squarely blame Crowdstrike for this whole thing, I think that's a reasonable question.
It is. And I'm sure the courts will consider all of the facts. But I mean, when you look at the scale of that Crowdstrike mess, it's not surprising that we're going to see this get dragged through the courts. And, the investors, they saw the share price go, from 300 something to 200 something over the course of this. So you can see why they're also, spitting tax.
Yeah, I mean, an investor lawsuit was just completely inevitable here. Yeah, Interestingly enough, the lawsuit also names the chief executive of Crowdstrike, George Kurtz, and the CFO, Bert Podbear, as defendants. So, straight for the throat, straight for the CEO's throat, right? Right for the throat. So we've got a couple of reports there from Cybersecurity Dive. One is by David Jones and one is by Roberto Torres. So we'll link through in this week's show notes and you can check it out. Now, meanwhile, Crowdstrike has released its external technical root cause analysis, channel file 291. Originally it released a preliminary incident response, very light PDF talking about what happened. Now they've done something kind of more detailed, but it is, to be honest, I find it pretty awfully written, and a little bit, just a little bit kind of, I don't know, there's not as much detail in this as I would have liked. I guess I need to correct something I said, which is early on, I'm like, it looks like they didn't test it at all. It looks like they did test this channel file update, but the testing was just woefully inadequate. But walk through this report. It's a 12-page PDF that CrowdStrike's released here. Walk through your reading of it, Adam.
Yeah, so the basic guts of it is it describes how CrowdStrike's kernel driver, which implements kind of detection mechanisms, receives configuration via these channel file updates, and kind of how the testing process works for the code that makes up the kernel driver, the data files that get fed to it, and then the kind of like the process by which they are kind of integration tested. And it comes up with a couple of, places where things went wrong for them. And I mean, like all of these outages, there is a confluence of things that go wrong to cause it to be, a planet melter. And in this case, it kind of comes down to the code that was checking for named pipes had a parameter which you could use regular expressions to, to refine the match. And in their test cases, they'd only ever tested it with a wildcard. So I'm assuming that parameter was blank or not used. And it turned out that a bug in the code miscounted the number of parameters. And so they were able to, read off the end of an array looking for this parameter at the point where they actually shipped a rule that used a regular expression instead of a wildcard match. And it seems like their kind of like the software test cases that they had written didn't include that example. And then another piece of code that validated kind of the number of parameters and so on also was wrong. So those two things lined up and led to shipping a bug, shipping a system that, caused an invalid read and often to blue screens of death. And they describe the testing processes they go through. And there is, as you said, there's quite a lot of words in here. But in the end, the net result is they didn't test it in a way that didn't
expose the fault.
Many planes stopped flying. There's a few lessons for them to be learned there. And they've also discussed their use of like deployment rings, of deploying the code over time, or whatever changes they're making, be it configuration, be it code, to different groups of user base over time to try and catch these things before they turn into planet melters, when it's only country melter or business melter, as opposed to entire planet.
Well, I mean, they've talked about how they did not use deployment rings in this case, not how they did use deployment rings in this case.
They have deployment rings, but it read like perhaps they used it for code, but not for data or something. Like it was a little bit weaselly about exactly where
they did not use deployment rings in the case of this update. That's and here we are, right? So clearly they did not. Obviously, they would have the infrastructure that would allow them to do that. For whatever reason, they chose not to do that in this case, probably because they have a great content validator and, they've done it a million times before. Thousands and thousands of these updates have gone out over the last 10 years, but, you and I have spoken about how complacency can get you into real trouble in situations like this. So, that is, in my mind, still falls into the inexcusable category. The fact that they weren't doing ring deployments for this is just absolutely nuts, and particularly because they're operating in the kernel. And this is something that came up, quite a lot in the conversations I had with like Alex Stamos and Chris Krebs, who obviously work for a competitor, right? They've got a vested interest in being particularly critical of CrowdStrike. But I happen to agree with them that this is just, kind of madness. If you're going to run an architecture like this, you really do need to be careful. And I mean, one thing that would have exposed, one thing in testing that would have exposed this bug is if they had rebooted the test boxes, right? Because, you get named pipe creation, it would have exposed this bug, and, which is why reboots didn't fix this, and it was just endless BSOD loops. So I don't know. I mean, they've written this in a way to be as boring as possible, right? In the hope that people's eyes just glaze over and they don't really pay much attention. There's also odd things in here, like they've got a mitigation, which is, you can provide customer control over the deployment of rapid response content updates. No one is going to use that. The whole purpose of using something like CrowdStrike is that it is essentially a managed service, something like Falcon Complete with your Overwatch service and all of that. You get them to do it so you don't have to think about this stuff. So I found that a pretty insane sort of thing to put in here. I don't think this is particularly exculpatory, this report. I think that in their heads it is, which is, you think about the Swiss cheese failure model where all the holes have to line up for a failure like this to happen. And I'll concede that they got unlucky, but you have to, when you're running something like this, you have to account for the fact that you can be really unlucky. And I don't think that they did to a sufficient degree. What's your feeling there?
Yeah, I mean, in the end, when you are running in kernel mode, you have an obligation to not screw up, because if you do, you're going to take the whole box down. And we've seen plenty of people break things in kernel space before in antivirus products and whatever else, but breaking it in such a way that it breaks on boot, like effectively bricking the whole thing, like that's a real worst
that's
case,
the thing,
right?
Isn't it? That's the thing where people who sort of stick up for CrowdStrike here and say, but they do things properly. They do have really good QA procedures. And it's like, well, clearly not good enough.
Yeah.
Clearly not good enough. And people say, oh, well, failures could happen to anybody. And okay, they can, but a failure like this is so catastrophic and so difficult to recover from that I just think they needed to be more careful.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, like the impact is what matters, right? All of these bad things happened, and, it kind of doesn't matter how, what your technical arguments are about the testing process or the things they do. It's kind of outcomes based, right? I mean,
yes.
Planes stop flying because of a thing you did. No amount of weaseling is going to make those planes go back in time and fly.
Yeah.
So,
I think it's, the words that I keep coming back to is, self-evident.
Yes.
It is self-evident that they were not doing an adequate job, I think.
Yeah, and I guess, the shareholder lawsuits will decide whether, the courts agree.
Yeah. What else have we got here? So here's an interesting one. I should point out too, it's a relatively slow news week because it's Black Hat and DEF CON week, and it's always a slow news week when that happens. But we do have, we've still got a bit to get through today. One that's interesting here, I've linked through to our colleague Catalin Kimpanu's write-up on this. But there's been this funny issue where Digicert, the CA, was found to have issued some certificates that were didn't have complete information or whatever, and they revoked them because they're terrified they're going to get yanked out of the browser trust stores, which has caused one customer who was affected here said, well, hang on, you've just given us 24 hours notice. So they went to court to try to get an injunction. I think they actually got it as well, which would have given them 3 days to do the remediation here. So it was interesting seeing this decision sort of spill out into legal action. But I gotta say, I'm kind of on the customer's side here. I think if Digicert has issued certificates that it shouldn't have and wants to revoke them, fair enough. But give them a little bit more than 24 hours. Was that where you landed on this?
Yeah, I felt bad for the customers in this case because, having to roll all of your certs, because typically an organization is only going to use one CA, right? They're not going to be shopping around. There's no kind of diversity there. You're going to have one vendor, and having to roll every cert in your environment in the space of 24 hours, that is a pretty heavy ask. And I can see that, when you look at the backstory of the issue here. So Digicert, they do domain validated certificates where you have to modify your DNS zone to prove that you have control over it to get the cert. And the specification for this process says those domain names that you have to put in your zone must start with an underscore. And Digicert made some change in 2019 that meant that the zones they generated for you to put in didn't have underscores in them. Which, I mean, okay, they're not, they are doing it wrong and they should do it right. But
yeah, I mean, they're not perfectly compliant, but it's not like it's, I mean, we've seen CAs do much stupider stuff than that.
We've seen CAs do a lot worse than this. But then it's just given that this happened in 2019, they started doing this. Now, it being a thing we have to resolve in 24 hours seemed like I can see why some of the customers were a little bit salty about that. And then, so they said 24 hours. A bunch of customers complained. Then they said, okay, we're going to go back and ask the browser vendors if they'll give us an extension overall. And so they got extension to 3 days. And then this customer, Alegeus, which is an American healthcare software as a service platform, said that they couldn't do it in 3, and they went to court, got an injunction for 7. Or at least they agreed in the process of taking them to court that they would get to 7. But again, Digicert had to go back to the CA browser forum and beg to be allowed to give the customers a week. So everybody involved kind of had a rough week at work. And it's nice to see this being taken seriously, because we've seen so many egregious failures of certificate authorities and the CA Browser Forum not bringing the ban hammer down on like really just stuff that absolutely they should have. This feels like a bit of an overcorrection, and I think everyone involved will have learned something from this experience. But
the CA Browser Forum is high on power. Dance monkey, pew pew pew. I mean that's kind of what it feels like a little bit. But it is good. It is good that the CAs are kind of like, terrified. Like we want the CAs to be terrified.
Yes, we do. So
who was it who got yeeted recently? Like it was like Entrust or someone, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So no wonder Digicert are like, geez, we left off the underscores, like panic stations. Right?
Oh dear.
Oh, it's funny the way that happens. Now let's talk about this Russian prisoner swap.
Yes.
That just happened, because there was some sort of erroneous reporting about that. I got suckered into that as well. I retweeted a tweet thread that talked about all of these cyber criminals that were exchanged. Now, for those of you who've not seen the news, there was a big sort of prisoner exchange between Russia and the West. A bunch of sort of criminals, Russian criminals, who had been detained in various places, some of whom had done things for the Russian state, like sanctions evasion. One of them had killed someone on order of the Kremlin in Germany and got caught and thrown in prison. They were a gangster who was essentially, took on a side gig as a sort of intelligence service sponsored assassin. So they've sprung a bunch of these guys and exchanged them for the US Marine Paul Whelan, also Evan Gershkovich, who was the reporter for a US newspaper, the Wall Street Journal, and they've swapped them. And yeah, initially it was like, oh my God, this really proves the nexus between cyber criminals and the Russian state, but not so fast. Like it looks like they're two of the people who were swapped out of 8 were cyber criminals, but it doesn't actually look like they were doing much at the behest of the state. So I did an interview yesterday with Dmitri Alperovitch, and I've posted the whole thing to YouTube. So if you want to go and subscribe to our YouTube channel, it's Risky Business Media. You'll find it, and you can watch the whole interview. But here's an excerpt where Dmitri talks about how, really this isn't necessarily about these guys being super secret, Russian cyber spies.
So there's no allegation that either of these guys were working for the state when they were doing these hackings. Maybe there's some private stuff in the indictments that never got disclosed or didn't get put in the indictment, I should say. But as far as we know, they were not involved in GRU or FSB or SVR hacking operations. But look, Putin has been very clear that he views any arrests of Russian citizens for crimes that they committed while being in Russia as extrajudicial. He views this as kidnappings, what the US DOJ does, and he wants to get everyone back. Now, I do think there's a prioritization, so you're going to be higher on the list given your political connections. And, same here, right? Evan Gershkovich was clearly at the top of the list, and some of the other folks that we still have there, unfortunately, fell off the list. So in that respect, it probably works fairly similar. But I don't think that he's looking just for people who have worked for the state. He wants any Russian that has been arrested for anything by U.S. Government.
And I think, we've established that you kind of agree. The consensus view that's forming seems to be that Putin got the better deal, but it was a deal that had to be done, and we in the West just have to take our medicine on this one.
Yeah, I do, and I think there'll be other deals for people that have already been arrested. But, beyond that, I think we need to be really thoughtful, because if you are still in Russia, either as a journalist today, a Western journalist, or an expat, and you get picked up, you've had plenty of warning, right? So to release another, particularly hardened criminals, it's one thing to release, these illegal spies, that's what we've done throughout the first Cold War. But to get these killers out, to get these smugglers out, cyber criminals, that's a totally different issue. And I think we need to be reconsidering that going forward for people that are still, walking around in Russia and have not left the country. They kind of made their bed, in my view.
So yeah, that was Dmitri Alperovitch there, and you could check out the whole interview on our YouTube page. So, I mean, I think people might be reading a little bit too much into this one. I also think it's funny that like a couple of days after the trade, Russian authorities released like video of these guys and like why they were arrested. In the case of Evan Gershkovich, he was doing some risky journalism. Like he was doing stories about like how Russia was able to refurbish tanks to get them to the front line in Ukraine. And, you know, they arrested him with a source who had brought classified documents with him, which to me feels a little bit like a setup. He had actually asked the source not to bring the documents. But then once he turned up with them, he said, look, we'll attribute anything in these documents. I'm not going to take them with me, but I'll attribute things in them to anonymous sources and blah, 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 blah. So you can see why that would get you into a bit of legal trouble in Russia. In the case of the totally innocent and not at all intelligence connected former Marine Paul Whelan, they had video of him being handed a thumb drive in a bathroom, which I got to say didn't look particularly exculpatory. Sorry to use that word twice in the podcast, but yeah, what's your take on all of this?
I mean, it did feel a little bit rude seeing, you know, especially in the case of like guys who've been carters heading back to Russia, and you know, kind of the amount of protection that those guys feel, you know, when they're out and about. You know, because like a couple of the cyber people were arrested like on holiday. One was in Switzerland or something, going skiing or something.
One was going skiing in Switzerland. The other one turned up to the Maldives with a plane full of hookers, right? Yeah. And this is how they got arrested. And yeah, like the Carter guy, that's like track 2, like infamous Carter was serving like a 27-year sentence, had been in prison for like 9 years. The other guy had only been in prison for a couple of years, but it looks like it's entirely possible that these guys were sprung more because their dads were like Putin's golfing buddies than the fact that they were doing secret FSB operations. You know, I guess that's my point.
Yes, yeah, and I think that was an interesting, because I also saw that thread that you tweeted, and that was the kind of, there was some implication there that was it. And I thought, you know, the conversation with you and Dmitri, I felt kind of cleared up a little bit of that for me, because nepotism definitely seems, you know, kind of more believable in a way.
It's on brand, right? It's definitely on brand. Yeah.
Yeah, it certainly is.
Yeah. Look, as Dmitri said in that interview too, there's a few more remaining, certainly on the cyber side, and we might see further swaps in the future.
Yeah, I would not be surprised. It seems to be how things are done. I found Dimitri's comments about, you know, at some point, if you're someone who can be taken hostage and you're operating in Russia at this point, you know, there is a degree of responsibility there that perhaps
I mean, I even said in that interview that like I had to drive to Brisbane the other day to pick up my mother-in-law who's flown in for a few weeks, and so I listened to a lot of podcasts and whatever, and I was listening to the BBC, and there's the BBC correspondent in Moscow, and I'm just thinking, why are you still there? Like that is seems a bit dangerous, but you know, it is what it is. Now let's talk about this story by Alexander Martin over at The Record, which says that hackers remotely wiped 13,000 students' iPads and Chromebooks.
Oh dear.
And this happened in, apparently, I think it was at Singapore, and it was mobile. It was the Mobile Guardian, like MDM platform, somehow was used to wipe 13,000 devices, which probably isn't what you want out of your MDM platform, if I'm being honest, right? Like you want to be able to do remote wipe when you leave it in a cab,
you do,
right? You don't want to be able to do remote wipe of 13,000 devices. I'm kind of surprised that like there's not a control to stop that from happening.
I mean, there probably will be now.
Yeah.
Because we haven't seen any details about exactly like how this went down from a technical perspective, like whether it was intrusion into some backend system of Mobile Guardian or whether it was like, you know, account compromise of the like Singapore Ministry of Education's account with Mobile Guardian, like through their admin panel or whatever it else. Because
or whether or not it was some application bug that allowed them to jump tenants. Like we don't know.
Tenant bug. We don't really know. Mobile Guardian did seem to suggest that it had affected some customers elsewhere, so not just Singapore, and this was just the sort of the most noticeable of the impacts.
Which makes you think, you know, some admin account at head office got done.
Could have been,
or it's a cross-tenant bug.
Or it's a cross-tenant bug, or I mean, even something like, you know, looking at Snowflake, where it is attackers figure out that this is a target you could hit, go look in data breaches, find a dozen customer accounts, hit each of them with the same thing. So, it's kind of...
I heard something interesting. I'm not 100% sure. This isn't verified yet. But I heard that a lot of those Snowflake accounts, the reason they didn't have MFA is because people were using command line tools to access them, right? Yeah. And they didn't support MFA. So that's, I'll look into that, everybody. I'll try to find out more, but that's just something I heard the other day. But I just took us off topic there. Sorry.
Yes, this is why API tokens exist. So we don't know specifically what happened, but either way, I imagine it's a pretty rough day at school in Singapore when, all your students have their stuff wiped. So yeah, good reminder of the power of MDM and the importance of securing access to the admin interface of those.
Yeah, and this week's sponsor interview is actually kind of relevant to this. I mean, it may be relevant, it may not be, but the overall theme is relevant, right? Which is Thinkst have this blog post up, and I'll link through to it. It's actually really funny. Did you read it? I sent you a link. Yeah. And it's legit funny, right? Which is everybody wants to build, when they're operating a cloud-based service, like software as a service, everybody wants to build like that really sophisticated application, like the multi-tenant thing. And that's just the way it's done. And they argue that like that makes life easier for the software provider, but doesn't really do anything for the customer. And software providers just like doing that so they don't have to run a bunch of VMs. Yeah. So what Thinkst did is they're like, no, we're just going to do one VM for customer per customer, and we're just going to get really good at managing like thousands of VMs in a fleet. Which, and of course, I'm sure there are accounts at Thinkst HQ that if you got access to them, you could do some real damage. They use SaltStack. I'm sure that, with enough research budget, and if you could punch through, get shell on one of those boxes, on one of those VMs, you might be able to find some sort of lateral movement bug.
There's certainly been those bugs in the past with Salt. I've used them.
Yeah, but I still accept the major point, right? Yes. Which is that, this is a decision that people make to make their lives easier, not the customer more secure, right? And it's an interesting bit of challenging, what do we call it? Challenging thinkfluencing from the people at Thinkst, and I did really enjoy it.
Yeah, so I would
go on.
I would much rather manage a fleet full of VMs with controls they understand than some enterprise Java monsterware that I have to go reverse engineer to understand how those multi-tenant controls actually, as built work.
Well, and there's so much attack surface in those web applications, right? Like one mistake and then it's cross-tenant and everyone's done, right? So that was an interesting chat, and I just find it relevant to that, that MDM piece. So again, that one's going out in the audio version of this podcast, but not on YouTube this week. Sorry. Okay, this story, I don't even know if it's technically a cyber story, but I had to include it. So Suzanne Smelly wrote this one up for The Record, and it's about how Ford is seeking a patent for technology that would allow its cars to like do surveillance things like, identify speeding drivers and whatnot. Now, there's been hand-wringing over this, and fair enough. But the reason I wanted to talk about this is I wrote a very similar story back when I was writing for a living. The byline on this piece is March 4th, 2004, which was about, so it was less about 20 years ago, over 20 years ago, right? Yeah. So my story is about how Toyota demoed a concept car that would adjust the performance of a vehicle based on whether or not you were a crappy driver who like did speeding, or whether or not, you'd lost points on your license or whatever. But it's just funny that this is something that just comes up a lot. Every time there's a motor show where car makers demonstrate some sort of creepy feature, it just all comes back. And of course, now there's this huge conversation about cars being these sensor platforms that collect all sorts of data, and there's not really good legal frameworks in a lot of countries for dealing with how that data is stored and whatever. I just think this is interesting that this just keeps coming up and coming up and coming up.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting topic. And I know, when we put together the run sheet, the news list that we're going to go through for the show, probably, I would say for the last 6 months, every 2 or 3 episodes, there's a story about automobile data collection or increasing amount of sanctions or controls around self-driving cars or autonomous vehicles or sensor platforms on cars or, connected cars. And I think I saw like this morning that the United States is about to ban like Chinese operating systems for cars. Yeah, there was some proposal for a self-driving car testing in the US by Chinese vehicle manufacturers, and also some controls around connected cars, right? And these things come up very regularly, and a lot of the time it gets filed under, okay, this is really interesting, and at some point there will be a reckoning, and we're going to have to talk about this in a bunch of detail. But we're not quite there yet, because everyone's still a bit, up in the air about exactly what our expectations are and how interdependent we want our vehicle ecosystems to be, and so on. I mean, it is creepy stuff, but then again, like if you go to a car show, how many concept cars with weird, ideas and stuff do you see that then never see the light of production? So there's real meat here to talk about, but it's still kind of settling. And this was just one more piece in that sort of puzzle for me.
Well, if you want to know what civil libertarians think about this, you can read my report for Wired from 20 years ago.
I did like, actually, in your piece, it talked about an idea of having the license plate just display the driver's license number of the driver rather than it being the car, that seems like a practical, useful thing to do, actually. But yeah.
Didn't happen, though, did it?
Didn't happen. Yeah, exactly.
Now, look, talking about, speaking about things that are like kind of evergreen topics, let's talk about Cloudflare sucking. Because we got a report here from Dan Gooden, Spamhouse, who are also always, that's been a constant through my career as well, which is Spamhouse complaining about people sucking. Who they complain about tends to change decade by decade, but they're always complaining about someone. And at the moment, they're complaining about Cloudflare. Like, I've complained frequently on this program about how Cloudflare, platform Nazis, racists, hate forums, all that sort of stuff. Yeah. And they say we're just a pass-through service, so they wash their hands of it. Whereas we've seen, when they kicked 8chan off their platform, where's 8chan now, right? You never hear about 8chan anymore. So we know that they can, get rid of services that are using them to stay online. And yet they say, oh, but we're just a pass-through service. It's got nothing to do with us. So Spamhouse has put out some numbers on just the scale of abuse. So we're not talking about nasty content, hate sites and whatever. We're talking about abusive domains that are being, linked to spam and things like that. And just say that, the usual story, Cloudflare is not really responsive. I mean, this is something that I hear from everyone as well. Threat researchers and stuff who find infrastructure or content being served up via Cloudflare, they write to Cloudflare, they never hear back. Yeah. And, it's just, again, same old story, just coming up again.
Yeah, yes. Spamhouse wrote a blog post with the specifics of their complaint, which was entitled Too Big to Care, Our Disappointment with Cloudflare's Anti-Abuse Posture. And they make the argument that fully 10% of the domain names on their Spamhouse block list, which is all sorts of, cybercrime and whatever related things, fully 10% are name servered by, have used name services provided by Cloudflare, like not even necessarily the CDN part of it. And I mean, that is a real, that's a real set of numbers. Like, I mean, that list does contain a whole bunch of nasty stuff. And they make the point that just go to Google, search for bulletproof hosting, and check how many of the responses you get are name served by Cloudflare. And that's maybe a thing that Cloudflare could do something about.
It's funny, right? Because they go through the whole experience that Brian Krebs had when he had that record DDoS, and Cloudflare came and offered to help him, and he told him to pound sand, right? He told them to go away. Because, and it's interesting, when I first met Brian, I met him maybe just over 10 years ago. I think we may have met before, but it was the first time we hung out, and we actually had this very conversation then.
Evergreen.
Yeah, evergreen. I think that's the theme of the week, isn't it? Evergreen. But yeah, I was talking to him, and he's just like, do you know how many of the DDoS for hire services are protected by Cloudflare that offers DDoS for hire protection, right? And it's just, so I know he's always found that weird. So it was good to see that in Dan's piece. Now, speaking of Brian, he's got a fantastic write-up here about a crime group called Dark Angels, which sometimes does ransomware, but quite often does not, which appears to be an extremely profitable cybercrime organization that doesn't deploy ransomware always because it makes too much noise, right? So what they do, they're more like they tend toward data extortion. The reason I find this interesting and the reason I find this worth talking about is because, in my view, if we had cyber criminals doing data extortion, that's a win. You know, my beef with ransomware, and the reason that I've always sort of thought there should be more state intervention and more involvement from groups like Cyber Command, NSA, you know, ASD, the whole Five Eyes Alliance, pushing back on that stuff, is because of the disruption it causes to operations, to hospitals, to, you know, all sorts of critical suppliers, pathology labs. You know, so healthcare is a big one, obviously, but even just normal enterprises. Whereas if they're just stealing data and ransoming it back, okay, that sucks for the victims, but it's a crime type that's much less disruptive to wider society. So I found this a really interesting write-up, and if this is the beginning of a trend, that would be terrific.
Yeah, I thought this was interesting for the same reasons, right? If this is the beginning of a trend, then maybe it's a movement in the right direction. And one of the points Brian makes around this group is, he calls them low drama, which is kind of a nice kind of shorthand term for it, I guess. But, you know, they are not an as a service operation. They're not a like affiliate model. They're not big and flashy. They are, I'm assuming, a pretty small group of people who are capable of doing this in a kind of more controlled, more competent, kind of more professional is what I was left thinking, which is a terrible thing to say. Like, they seem more professional at it, and as a result are able to extract some pretty whopping ransoms. Brian talks about one where they got $75 million from a Fortune 50 company.
Yeah, it was a pharmaceutical company, and you just wonder, wow, what was the data they got there? It must have been important.
Well, exactly, yeah. And I guess, you know, the sort of the ransomware where it's just a whole bunch of affiliates going buck wild and making heaps of mess is bad for society as a whole, and slightly more targeted, slightly more professional. Yes, it sucks, as you say, but that's probably still an improvement. So
I mean, it's the difference between a junkie robbing a 7-Eleven with a screwdriver and, you know, the bank robbery crew from Heat.
Yes.
You know, this is...
Which, yeah, I mean, I guess that's an improvement. I mean,
then again, I guess with, you know, the asymmetry of ransomware, I guess it's like a junkie robbing a major bank with a, you know, space weapon or something, right? I don't know. I'm going to have to work on that metaphor a little bit. But, you know, if we're only left with the true professionals and they're not actually deploying ransomware, they're finding a way to get paid without that, I just think that's a massive step in the right direction, which might sound like a weird take, but you know, it is. It is.
And maybe those guys are easier targets for, you know, because like, who was it you were talking to? There was someone you interviewed, which was saying like scaling up intervention by intelligence agencies, you know, is a waste of resources, because intelligence agencies have other things to do, right? They've got important intelligence work to be doing, and we can't just expect them to solve ransomware, you know, using their special skills and techniques and whatever. If you have a smaller group of professional targets, then it's a bit more manageable for intels and spooks and so on to go disrupt.
Well, I mean, I think ultimately we need dedicated resources. I think that was with Chris Krebs, you know, like, maybe God, no, yeah. Not a new agency, I think is what he said.
Yes.
Please,
yes,
God, no. That was an interview I did with him about transnational, him and Alex Stamos, about, you know, transnational cybercrime. It was an interesting interview, that one.
One of the wide world of cyber ones. Yes.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
And no, I did find that interesting, but I think we do need dedicated resources, whether or not they're sort of seconded over from various existing agencies or not. This idea, and I think a lot of that comes from the agencies themselves, who are like so busy with very serious national security work that when a national security advisor or whoever comes in and says, hey, we'd like you to deal with ransomware, they say, we don't really have time for this, right? So, whereas, you know, in Australia after the Medibank thing, I think the government's message to the agencies was, well, you're going to have to make a little bit of time. and they did, and they got a result there. But I think perhaps, you know, giving them extra resources to handle this, I think it's a bit of a bureaucratic problem, really, where they, you know, they're having to divert resources from other things. Whereas if we could get to a point where they just have that little bit extra, because they've got the authorities, they've got the you know, their own sort of TTPs for dealing with this stuff, but resources are a constraint. And, you know, then we get into the whole conversation about government salaries and, you know, blah, 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 blah. So it's a big topic. Anyway.
Like, no wonder we have so many listeners in the spook world when we're here advocating for them to have more budget.
Well, I mean, you know, I think it's a fair ask in this case, right?
Yeah,
if you ask them to do more stuff, they probably need a better headcount. Now we're going to move on and talk about this story from Lorenzo Franceschi Beccarai over at TechCrunch. And apparently Bumble and Hinge, the dating sites, were exposing a little bit too much information about the distance that users were away from each other. So if you're using a dating app, it'll show you, this person is Stacy or Bob, and they are located, 1.2 kilometers away from you or whatever. That's the way it works on Tinder and whatnot. But apparently with Bumble and Hinge, like the information was much higher resolution in the background, and it's possible to pull that out. And if you could sort of triangulate a user, you could get a very accurate location on them. This seems like a really dumb thing for them to have done. Like, I'm actually quite surprised that a modern dating app would expose that information and let people do this, because it just seems like such an obvious problem,
It does seem an obvious problem, and if you compared it to Tinder, so in Tinder's case, they appear to store the location information kind of rounded up in the backend, so there isn't high resolution information available there, whereas in these other apps, Grindr, I think, was also on this list that the researchers looked at. It's rounded up in the front-end user display, but is still high resolution in the back end. And by,
so they just do it with some like client-side JavaScript or whatever, right?
Yeah, or they have multiple accounts that pretend to be in different locations and then kind of trilaterate based on that, which, if you had asked, when you were building these apps, you'd asked anyone who worked in, that kind of, geospatial data processing or whatever, like, how would you do it? So of course, it's an obvious thing that they would suggest. And so it is surprising that it still works, but there's plenty of dating apps, and I guess, there's a lot of minimum viable product that makes it into prod, and here we are.
Well, Adam, mate, that's actually it for this news discussion. We are going to roll on to the sponsor interview in the audio edition of the show, but that's it for us on YouTube today. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Pat, and I'll see you next week.